Okay guys, good morning. So I'm going to talk to you today about a book by called The Rector's Daughter, and as I explained to you, that means a priest's daughter. We're going to be looking at a passage from this particular novel, which was written in 1924, which is after the First World War, and it's during what we call the Georgian era. And I'm going to look at the passage within the context of changing roles of women, the woman's vote, and the idea of looking very critically at the Victorian age, okay? This is Flora MacDonald Mayer. She was one of the most famous novelists in Britain just after the war. She was also a short story writer. She's someone who's sort of disappeared from literature now. She's no longer famous, but in her day she was very famous, largely because she wrote female-centered literature, in which she actually looked very critically at the role of women and the way that girls in particular were treated within the family. And she wrote very critically of the Victorian age. Just want to remind you about the unseen. As always, I want to remind you that the most important thing is to get your argument right, your AO1, followed by your AO2, your language, form and structure. But I didn't want you to forget, 24% of the mark on the unseen comes from AO3, from showing a sense of context. And that's why, before the exam, I really need us to develop our historical and cultural and social kind of ideas so that you are always able to see the text within a context, okay? There it is. If we're marking out of 25, it's a whole 6 marks for AO3. So it is a very important element of it, and in every time that you do an unseen, I think we'd like at least 3 major points about history or about cultural reception. Okay, so let's not forget, I do need you to stick to the passage, to look at the question very carefully. Remember, we talked before that ideally we'd like to argue in 3 paragraphs, and in terms of our different answers, we need to have paragraphs that go on from one another. That means that they usually are going to begin with connectives. And as I've said to you on a number of times, your arguments are usually additive or they're contrasting. So you're going to say, furthermore, moreover, and you're going to be adding to your argument, or you're going to be starting with an idea of however, whilst, and you're going to be changing track and showing that there are 2 different ways of seeing the argument. Almost always, a better essay will look at more than one side of the argument, okay? There is a table, I'm not going to go through it, just to remind you that you can either completely agree with the statement, you can modify the statement, that is, you can be partly in favor of it and partly oppose it and then find a resolution, or you can be completely against the statement and find 3 different types of evidence in which you go against it entirely, okay? Right, then to deal with our paragraph today, Flora MacDonald Mayer, she was born in 1872, so she was born towards the end of the Victorian era. She was from an Anglican clergyman. Anglican means the Church of England. Clergyman again means a priest. Very educated man. He was a professor of classics, and he was also a moral philosopher at King's College London, one of the preeminent universities in Britain. Her mother was Alexandria Grote. She was the niece of a utilitarian, which is a particular form of religion in the Victorian era called nonconformist. So it's quite interesting that her father and mother came from different religious backgrounds. Maybe it accounts for the fact that she was quite broad-minded in many ways. And this I thought you'd find very interesting. Flora went on to read history at Newnham College, Cambridge. Now that's a very early stage for someone to go to Cambridge. If you think about our book Atonement, where Cecilia goes to Cambridge, she goes to Cambridge in the 1930s, doesn't she? Whereas Flora MacDonald Mayer would have gone to Cambridge in the 1890s. So that's real groundbreaking stuff, isn't it? And it's when women's education is really taking off. Those of you who've looked at George Eliot before will know that George Eliot didn't go to university, but her and her friend Emma Davies helped give money to help women actually go to Oxford and Cambridge. So I want to remind you that even though the Victorian age is often seen as a very conservative time, towards the end of the 19th century, a lot of things are changing for women, and in particular, the women's suffrage movement is very big, agitating for the vote. So the extract that we're going to look at today is published from The Rector's Daughter, which was published in 1924, and it tells the story of Mary Jocelyn, who's the daughter of the rector, Canon Jocelyn. After many years of loneliness and selfish devotion to her father, Mary thinks that she's found love in her relationship with her father's friend, Mr. Robert Herbert. Mary's friend Dora encourages her to have hopes of marriage. However, as you're going to see in the extract, the father is somebody who doesn't seem to really be aware of his daughter's love life. And so I wanted to give you some context today about the idea of the Victorian spinster, because we've looked at before at the idea of the angel in the home, the idea of the perfect wife. Today I wanted to focus on a little bit of a forgotten figure, which is the perfect daughter. Because of course Victorian women were idolized, they were seen as angels, and devotion to your father was also seen as really important. And that meant that many girls didn't in fact get married and actually spent a great deal of time looking after their fathers. And in this passage today, I think you're going to find the cultural context that I go through quite relevant. I wanted to start off though by telling you a little bit about the Bloomsbury group, or the Bloomsbury set. And they were a collection of writers, philosophers, and artists. And they included incredibly famous people like Virginia Woolf, who we're going to study, who's a very famous novelist. John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is still studied today in economics. So if any of you study economics, he's considered a brilliant man. Ian Forster, who most famously wrote A Passage to India. And Lytton Strachey, who was a biographer and historian, okay? These people lived in an area called Bloomsbury, and they saw themselves as very cultured people. They were very culturally influential. As I showed you, they were artists and historians and all kinds of things, okay? And they believed that Britain had lost its way and that the arts had lost importance. And they were, above all, very modern in their thinking. They were very hostile to the Victorians. And I'm going to be talking to you today in particular about this guy, Lytton Strachey, who wrote a book called The Eminent Victorians, which really lambasted and attacked Victorian England and helped to give us the image we have today, a very negative view of the Victorians, okay? Here's a plaque where you can see, you can go and see this today in London. The Bloomsbury area still exists, where all of these highly influential people lived. Here's a picture of Lytton Strachey. He himself was openly homosexual, very modern. Again, so someone who's going to really attack the Victorian age as a small-minded, conservative, stupid, bigoted age. This is the book he wrote, guys, and it's worth you being able to talk about this. Eminent Victorians looked at a whole variety of famous Victorians like Florence Nightingale that you can see there, like General Gordon, etc. These are people who were seen as great heroes by the Victorians, but Strachey actually despised them, and he wrote an incredibly critical book about them, okay? And one of the things I wanted to show you here, so the book was the idea for it first developed in 1912. And what Strachey wanted to do is he wanted to show you that these Victorian people didn't deserve their great reputations. He wanted to see them as hypocrites. But you'll notice the date, that's 1912. When he actually starts really writing it, okay, and it gets published in 1917, you'll realize that the First World War is going on. And what Strachey began to think is, not only were the Victorians hypocrites, he actually began to see them, as I say here, as profoundly evil. And he saw them as evil because he saw them as producing the ideology that led to the First World War. And he saw them as basically imperialist, small-minded. And I think that it's hard to actually overestimate how powerful this book was. For instance, he took the figure of Dr. Arnold, who was very famous because of a book called Tom Brown's School Days. Dr. Arnold was the principal of Rugby School, and he was seen as a great man, a religious man, a wonderful headmaster who instilled great noble ethics in the schoolboys of Rugby. In fact, Scratchy decides that he was a bully, a horrible man, stupid, small-minded, and incredibly bigoted. And this is typical of what Scratchy did. He basically parodied a lot of Victorians and made us dislike them. Now, in the extract that we look at today, I've asked the question, explore the view that Mary, she's the character in this extract, is the victim of abuse by her father. And I will explain to you now why you need to know some of this historical background. What does the word abuse mean? Well, I've looked it up in the dictionary, and we've got here extremely offensive and insulting. The synonyms, we've got a rude, vulgar, offensive, disparaging, derogatory, etc., or engaged or characterized by habitual violence and cruelty. And the synonyms are cruel, brutal, savage, inhuman, barbarous, brutish. I want to remind you, it's really important in your essays always to define those key terms in the title. You don't have a dictionary before you, so you're going to invent your own definition, aren't you, which you will make clear in that essay. What do we mean by abusive? Now, remember I said to you that female obedience was enshrined in Victorian ideology. We saw in the idea of the angel in the house, the ideal wife. But this also extended to the ideal of the dutiful daughter, and that's where it's going to be very interesting in our passage today. This is a famous painting by an American artist, Benjamin Stahl. It's called Victorian Parents and Spinster Daughter. So actually the spinster daughter, the unmarried daughter, figured quite highly in Victorian literature because many parents expected such filial duty from their children that they kept them at home to kind of look after them, almost as unpaid servants or companions. And obviously that's quite a tragedy for a lot of young women in particular, because if you're an unmarried man, you've always got your career, haven't you? You've always got the ability to have a public life. But as an unmarried spinster daughter, you had an incredibly claustrophobic, restricted life. Now, in 1924, when our book, The Rector's Daughter, is published, women have just got the vote. They haven't got it entirely, but by 1918, the principle that women could get the vote had been won. So what did that actually mean? Well, it meant great changes in the lives of women. And there were huge changes in terms of, as we see in The Great Gatsby, don't we, with Jordan Baker and the flappers in America. In England, you had women agitating for greater education. You have women joining the workforce. Now that they have the vote, you have a real kind of enlargement of women's rights. Can we see that in Atonement? Yes, we can, can't we? We see that Cecilia is of a completely different mindset from Emily Tallis, her mother. Emily sees her role predominantly as that of the matriarch of the family. She sees her role as getting a suitable husband for Cecilia. Cecilia, on the other hand, looks to have a life of self-realization, of education, and she bridles at the lack of economic and career opportunities for herself. So I want you to think of this as the context for the passage that we are going to look at today. And now I want to go on to the passage and to look at it in some detail, but I hope that that gave you some background to think about the passage in. Thank you.